The Rebbe began the Farbrengen this afternoon that this is the Shabbos between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah. In other words, this past week we celebrated Yutas Kislev, and the week we are going into now we are going to celebrate Chanukah. The way the Kviyas was this year, that Yutas Kislev came out to be on a Tuesday, so that is why there is a Shabbos between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah. In other words, the Rebbe says there could be Kviyas that there would not be a Shabbos between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah. In other words, should Yutas Kislev fall out to be at the beginning of the week, for example, on a Shabbos or on a early part of the week, right after, then the first day of Chanukah is also in the same week together with Yutas Kislev. Chanukah begins at the end of the week. However, in a Kviyas like this year, there is a Shabbos between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah. And this Shabbos ties together both in Yonim, the Inyan of Yutas Kislev, as well as the Inyan of Chanukah. Because the Rebbe goes on, there is something equal to Yutas Kislev as well as to Chanukah. Chanukah, we know, we celebrate Chanukah with oil, with shemen. This is what happened in the Beis HaMikdash. In the Beis HaMikdash, the Yidden weren't able to find pure oil. And the Rebbe performed a miracle that there was only one jar of pure oil, which normally would have lasted only for one night, and this lasted for 8 days. Memela, it's a yontif that we celebrate that has to do with shemen. Yutas Kislev is the same idea, the Rebbe goes on. In Torah, we know there's a famous pasuk, Hey kol tzama lechula mayim, that Torah is referred to mayim, to water. However, it's explained in Chassidus, based on Chazal, that there are various levels in Torah. There is a level in Torah which is compared to water. However, there are madregas in Torah which are compared to wine, as well as to shemen, as well as to oil. And the highest madrega of Torah is compared to shemen. And shemen has something outstanding within itself. As we learn in Gemara Masechta Shabbos, the Gemara there discusses that shemen shetzaf al gabi mayim, or shemen shetzaf al gabi yayin. In other words, should you take oil and put it into any other liquid, the oil will always come up on top. That means the oil will always remain outstanding. So Mamela, this is explained in Chassidus that which chelik of Torah is compared to shemen. It's the chelik of roze de rozin, the chelik of pnimiyas haTorah. Roze Torah, the secrets of Torah, is compared to the level of wine, yeno shel Torah. However, roze de rozin, secrets of secrets in Torah, which is a yet higher madrega in pnimiyas haTorah, this madrega of Torah is compared to the level of shemen. And Memela, so we see how the idea of Yutas Kislev as well as the idea of Chanukah unite, because they both have in common with the idea of Shem. Then the Rebbe went on and explained that Bichlal, B'negei Chanukah, the question arises, there's a strong question, a famous question. We know that the Yidden found one jar of pure oil. And this jar of pure oil, rather than lasting for one night, was sufficient and lasted for 8 nights till the Yidden were able to have pure oil again. So there's a famous question, the question is asked all over, if that's the case, why do we celebrate Chanukah? For 8 days, we should only celebrate Chanukah for 7 days. Because for the first night, it normally would have lasted. There's no miracle involved in the fact that it lasted for 1 night. For 1 night, it had the regular quantity and it would last for 1 night. Everybody raises this question. So the Rebbe explained today that the emes is that Alpi Halacha, the Yidden could have lit the menorah with impure oil as well also. If they had impure oil, they were able to light it. Why? Because there's a klal, tuma dechuya b'tzibur, or should we use the expression tuma hutra b'tzibur? Explain the difference in a minute. When the entire tzibur, when the entire Jewish community is impure, then the dinim of tumah fall away. Now this is a discussion in itself, whether it's b'di eved, in other words, being as a result of these circumstances. So the expression, which would be a better expression to use, is tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Dinei tumah are pushed away when the entire community is tumah. Or to use another expression, tumah hutra b'tzibur. Hutra stemming from the word heter, it's permissive. In other words, being that the entire tzibur is impure, memela the dinei tumah are permissive, so the dinei tumah don't go on. So if so, the Yidden would have been perfectly okay if the Yidden would have gone ahead and lit the menorah with the impure oil. However, Chibasam shall Yisrael. Rabbi explained it previous years as well. The Yidden, when the Yidden went ahead here and lit the menorah, it was with a tremendous feeling of love to the Rebishter, of Chiba. The Yidden felt very strange. Here the Rebishter performed such great miracles for them. And they are back, and they can go into the Beis HaMikdash and renew the Beis HaMikdash again. This is the idea of Chanukah. Chanukah's HaBeis HaMikdash. And here they're going to light the menorah with impure oil. And halachically it's okay. There's no problem al pi halacha that's holding them back from it. However, psychologically it bothered them very much. Here, it's very strange for them. They're expressing thanks to the Rebishter. The whole idea of the Mishkan is, as the Rebbe explained today, the idea of Mishkan stems from the word Shechina. It's the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu dwelling in the Mishkan, and this is a center of HaKadosh Baruch Hu resting there, and from there it's spreading onto the entire world. This is the idea of Mishkan as well, the idea of Mikdash. So here they're going to light the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash with impure oil. This was something which really bothered them. Chibasan shel Yisrael, the love from the Yidden to the Rebishter, didn't let them do it. And when the Rebishter realized that the Yidden want to perform the mitzvah, not just the mere performance of the mitzvah, but they're performing the mitzvah with a lot of warmth and inspiration together with it. They want to perform the mitzvah in a real, perfect way. It should be Shem and Torah. It shouldn't be b'di'evadik. Halachat al pidin would be Yaitze. Here the Rebishter went ahead and made another nes that they found the Pach Shemen. So, based on this, the Rebbe concludes that the 8th day of celebration, or rather, why is there one other day that we celebrate the Yontif of Chanukah? Normally, as we just asked, we should have only celebrated for 7 days. Why do we celebrate for 8 days? Because the additional day we celebrate for the Yontif Takif for finding the Pach Shel Shemen. This in itself is a Yontif that the jar of pure oil was found. So to show our feeling and appreciation to the Rebishter that firstly, pure oil was found. So this in itself is oneness. So for this we celebrate one night. However, being that this pure oil would have normally lasted for one night, and here the Rebishter performed a miracle that it was able to burn in the menorah for 7 days, Memela, we celebrate it. We have a total of 8 days that we celebrate Chanukah. And the same idea is Benegay Yutas Kislev. Yutas Kislev, the Rebbe went on to explain, is also an Indian of a nes. It's also an Indian of a miracle, just like Chanukah. And in fact, the Rebbe says there's an expression in the Sichas from the Frierdiker Rebbe that Yutas Kislev is referred to as Chag HaChagim, a Yontif amongst Yomim Tovim, a Yontif, a real special Yontif. So Memela, all these are equal in Yonim between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah. Then the Rebbe went on, the fact that we have a Shabbos now between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah. What's the idea of Shabbos? The idea of Shabbos is Kol Malachtecha Asuya. The Yid is supposed to come Shabbos, the Yid is supposed to look that everything which he needs, all his needs are taken care of. However, at the same time, it's Misha Tarach Be'erev Shabbos, Yoichal B'Shabbos. If one prepares before Shabbos, he has on Shabbos. But when it comes Shabbos itself, we have to be in a position of Kol Malachtecha Asuya. The Rebbe went on, Mela, the idea of Yutas Kislev. What do we derive from Yutas Kislev? It's an additional call for Hafatas HaMayonis. We have to strengthen ourselves in getting involved more and more in the inyan of Hafatas HaMayonis, of spreading the wells of Chasidus. So the Rebbe mentioned it here briefly, and later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe spoke in length about it, that there's an expression from the Rebbe Rashab, that the Rebbe Rashab expressed himself that it was really after Peterburg, meaning after whole idea of Yutas Kislev, that Hasidus really began spreading much more force than Hasidus was spreading before the idea of Yutas Kislev. So Memela, we see that the whole Yontif of Yutas Kislev shows for the stronger spreading and dissemination of Hasidus. And we have to, just like now we have a Shabbos between Yutas Kislev and Chanukah, and Shabbos shows the idea of Kol Malachtecha Asuyos. The Rebbe goes on that it means that once we reach out to Yidden and we inspire Yidden with the idea of Hafatas HaMayonis, as well as the idea of Hafatas HaYadus, spreading Yiddishkeit and spreading Chasidus and bringing every Yid closer to Chasidus and to Yiddishkeit, there will be in Yonim. Naturally, there's the inyan which we put into the Yid, which when we make a contact and we associate ourselves with another Yid, we put in koiches into the Yid to bring him closer to Chasidus and to Yiddishkeit. Then the Rebbe says there are inyanim that happen in the Yid already later by himself. Just like Shabbos is Kol Malachtecha Asuyah. Memela, this is in Ruchnius as well. When a Yid gets Niskarav to Yiddishkeit, once he's already getting closer to Yiddishkeit as well as getting closer to Chasidus, there are inyanim that how the person improves by himself, just like the idea of Shabbos is kilu kol malachtecha asuya, the same thing in Ruchnius, in terms of having influence on another year, there's also a certain inyanim which come automatically, step by step, by a person, as compared to Shabbos, as compared to the thought of kol malachtecha asuya. And the Rebbe concluded the Sikha again with a call to see to it that every Yid should have an ois in the Sefer Torah, which is currently being written, as well as children should have an ois in the Sefer Torah that are being written for children. And again, the Rebbe mentioned the mitzvahs and the mifzoim shazman grama that are really negeya now. That's the idea of mitzvah Chanukah, because we're right now Erev Chanukah, to see that every Yid should be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Chanukah, as well as all other mitzvahs, which the Rebbe listed in all the 10 famous mifzoim. And the Rebbe concluded the Sikha that one of the mifzoim is the idea of Neira Shabbos Kodesh. And this is something which we lit yesterday on the entrance of Shabbos, the idea of lighting the Shabbos candles. The Rebbe referred to the famous Medrash that tells us that in the schus of lighting the Shabbos candles in the Matam Shamrem Neira Shel Shabbos, the Rebbe says that he will reward us by showing us the Neir of Tzion with the coming of Mashiach. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred to an inyan which he discussed in the Yutas Kislev Dike Farbrengen, and discussed it today as well. And this is also Benegeya, the inyan of Ksiva Sefer Torah. The original idea of Ksiva Sefer Torah is a mitzvah in the Torah. It's a mitzvah. In fact, according to most Meinei HaMitzvahs, this is the very last of the Taryag mitzvahs, because it's mentioned in the Pasuk in Parshas Vayeshev HaBarach. Hazino, I think. Vayelech. Thank you. So the Rebbe raised the question, Yutas Kislev, and the Rebbe continued it today, that if writing of Sefer Torah is a mitzvah, and it's a mitzvah min ha-Torah, why is it so uncommon? Why, Taka, don't we see that people should go after this mitzvah? If we look back throughout history, the Rebbe says, we really didn't see that Yidden should go ahead. He says it's very exceptional and very rare that a Yid should go ahead and write a Sefer Torah. If it's a mitzvah, like all other Taryag mitzvahs, then what should be common practice is we should see Yidden always throughout the generations, always getting involved in the idea of writing a Sefer Torah. And for some reason, the Rebbe says, nowadays, as well as in generations before, it's something which we don't see Yidden doing that, this practice. The emes, the Rebbe goes on, there's an expression in Shulchan Aruch, because this is a psak din, as well as in the Rambam, as well as in Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch adds on, v'ha'idna, meaning nowadays, the same mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah can be fulfilled not only by the writing of a Sefer Torah, but as well by any type of svarim. Svarim that serve as Mishnah, Gemara, Perushayin, and commentary on Mishnah and Gemara. So the Rebbe again asked, we don't see that Yidden should be involved in this part of the mitzvah. Again, this part of the mitzvah doesn't exclude the idea of writing Sefer Torah. Neither do we see people involved in writing Sefer Torahs. Neither do we see people involved in the idea of writing or acquiring or printing. Nowadays, there's no union of writing. Perhaps we don't see that a child. The Rebbe explained today. If this would be a mitzvah, that Yidden should be like all other mitzvahs in the Torah. Once a person becomes bar mitzvah, we should see that one of the first things he should do on the day of his bar mitzvah, we should see a child should go ahead and acquire svarim. Get a hold of Svarim, and the Rebbe says it's not seen. We look back, we see Yidden, Yereim, Mishleimim, Yidden that try to fulfill all the halachas of Shulchan Aruch and try to be Mahader and Machmir in all the halachas of Shulchan Aruch. And for a person that's a Yerei Shemayim, he definitely should have looked to go ahead and fulfill a mitzvah, which is a mitzvah min ha-Torah. And still we see he don't do it. It's not done. Rebbe mentioned incidentally, he said there are others that claim that the mitzvah of writing Sefer Torah is not the last mitzvah of the Taryag. There are others that claim that based on the pasuk Hav Shem Hashem Ekcha Havu Goydel Elokeinu, there are some Rishonim that claim that there is a mitzvah in Birchas HaTorah. What we do daily before we learn Torah, to make a bracha Birchas HaTorah, they derive this based on this pasuk. So they claim that is the last mitzvah. But regardless, getting back to the idea of Ksiva Sefer Torah, the question is back, why, Taka, don't we see that Yidden should be involved in the idea of writing Sefer Torah? And neither was it seen in previous generations and many generations ago. It was never seen, the Rebbe said. So the Rebbe went on to explain, there's a concept by Karbonis. Okay, take it from that end first. Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleihim. Which means that the Bezdin, the Jewish court, would do certain arrangements, and this arrangement would be like a permanent arrangement. I'll explain it a little bit in a minute. Which things would be based and tied into these conditions. For example, in the Beis HaMikdash it was a common practice to be makrif korbanos. We know there were korbanos yachid as well as korbanos tzibur, which means there was a korban brought daily, and sometimes there was more than one korban involved, Yom Tovim, Shabbosim, Rosh Chodesh, and this korban was brought on behalf of Klal Yisrael. We also know that there are certain requirements which the kohen that has to bring this korban has to have in mind 6 different types of inyanim. There are 6 kavanas that are ma'akiv the kohen by hakravas hakorban. Here comes in this idea of leiv bezdin masna aleim, which means that bezdin made an arrangement. In other words, bezdin set up a regular rule that whenever the kohen goes ahead and is makriv a korban on behalf of the tzibur, on behalf of the entire Jewish community, bezdin has arranged that this korban would be brought perfectly and as far as fulfilling all the halachic requirements that are needed for bringing this korban. And as the Rebbe explained, this does not mean that every single day of the existence of the Beis HaMikdash, Bezdin would call in the Kohanim and tell them, listen, these are the rules of the Korbanos, and this is what you must have in mind. No. This was a set arrangement. Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleim. Bezdin made this arrangement, and we lived with this arrangement constantly. That any time a Korban was brought, based on the introduction which the Bezdin at one time gave, that the Kohanim have to adhere to these halachas, it was a perfect korban, and the korban was brought on behalf of the entire Jewish community, and it was very well considered as if every Yid had a share in this korban. With this introduction, the Rebbe goes and will apply the very same idea b'negei to Sefer Torah. First, let us look at the source where we get the mitzvah of writing Sefer Torah. Mitzvah's ksiva Sefer Torah is based on a pasuk. Pasuk is va'ata kisvu lachem es hashira hazois. Now you shall write this shira. V'lamda es b'nei Yisrael sima b'fiyim. And as the Rambam explains, being that we cannot just write a portion of the Torah, just the shira, Memela, we derive from this pasuk that there's a mitzvah in writing the entire Torah. The Rebbe says if we look carefully into the pasuk, we see that there are 3 nekudas. There's kisvu, the fact of writing. There's a second concept of lochem, it has to be yours. And what is the reason why you have to write? Why the writing has to be, and why does it have to be yours? As the pasuk concludes, in order that it should be able to be learned. So we see what is the reason of mitzvahs ksiva Sefer Torah. In order to be able to learn Torah. There is also a halacha that if one goes ahead and reviews a Sefer Torah and checks a Sefer Torah, naturally a Sefer Torah has to be checked, and Sefer Torah, it's very common to find that a Sefer Torah needs correction. So the halacha tells us, and this is mentioned where the dinim of ksiva Sefer Torah are discussed, that he gets credit as if he had written a Sefer Torah. So we see that writing a Sefer Torah mustn't necessarily be to sit down and write a new Sefer Torah on parchment, a brand new Sefer Torah. But if one takes part in reviewing a Sefer Torah and making sure that the Sefer Torah is kosher, it is as well considered as if he would write the Sefer Torah himself. Rabbi goes a step further again. So we see nowadays as well, the Rebbe says, we see that what is a Sefer Torah kept for? A Sefer Torah is kept to read in shul. It's very rare that the Sefer Torah in the shul should belong to an individual. A Sefer Torah in the shul usually belongs to a community. Many times there are many individuals that own Sefer Torahs and they contribute their Sefer Torahs to the shul. However, most Sefer Torahs that are in a shul, it's a shul Sefer Torah, so it's a public Sefer Torah. So the Rebbe compares this to the same way like we learned before, b'negei korbanos tzibur, the same way a Sefer Torah becomes a Sefer Torah shalat tzibur, it becomes a public Sefer Torah. Just like Benegei Karbonis, the Rebbe goes ahead, we apply the philosophy of Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleim. This very same ruling will apply here Benegei Sefer Torah as well. When a Sefer Torah is written, or when a Sefer Torah is reviewed, and this, he says, is common practice in every shul. Naturally, every shul invites every couple of years or every year or whenever a Sefer that should come into the shul and review its Sefer Torah. But mainly by this review of Sefer Torah, or by the communal ownership of Sefer Torah, it's considered that each and every Yid gets part in the mitzvah of writing Sefer Torah. Because Kisvu is here, Lochem is here, and Lalamda is also here. These are the three requirements that have to be involved in the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah. That is why the Rebbe says there is a halacha. If one inherited a Sefer Torah from his ancestors, his parents had a Sefer Torah, and he inherited the Sefer Torah, the halacha would be that it is not considered as he'd written the Sefer Torah. Why? He has a Sefer Torah, the Sefer Torah is his. The Rebbe says if we look carefully, the Lachem is here, the Lalamda is here, however the Kisvu is missing, which is a third concept, which is all these three are conditions in the fulfilling of mitzvahs Ksiva Sefer Torah. Why is the Kisvu missing? Because he didn't write it, he got it from his ancestors, and he had no share in the writing of the Sefer Torah. However, as the general system is today, how Sefer Torahs are kept in shuls, and Sefer Torahs are kept maintained in the shuls, and they are read from in the shul. And the idea of reading in a Torah, this is an idea of mitzvahs Talmud Torah, this is the Lalamda. A shul, you read a Torah, you read Monday, you read Thursday, you read twice on the Shabbos. Memela, this is considered that every Yid has a chelik in this mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah. And being that every Yid has a part in the ownership of the Sefer Torah, in the maintenance of the Sefer Torah, so Memela, all this is part of the idea of Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleim. So it's again like Bezdin, like the Jewish court would have made an arrangement, and this is a permanent arrangement. This arrangement doesn't have to be reviewed constantly. Once this arrangement was set, it remains so as a precedent. Memela, this remains as a rule, that constantly every Yid is considered that he has a shaykhs in the Sefer Torahs. He has a part, he has a bailus, he has a share in the Sefer Torahs that are maintained by the shul which he's active in, which he davens in, which he's part of. And when these Sefer Torahs are reviewed, and when these Sefer Torahs are corrected, this is when he gets his share in the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah. The Lalamda is there because there's a constant learning and reading of the Sefer Torah. So we have the Kisvu, we have the Lachem, and we have the Lalamda. This is how the Rebbe is learning Pshat to Farenfa, to give an explanation why is it that throughout generations we have never seen individuals, or it was very rare to find individuals that should get involved in the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. So as the Rebbe explained it Yitas Kislev and completed it this afternoon, there was really no need for them to go ahead and hire a scribe and write an individual Sefer Torah. First of all, as the Rebbe explained today, this was something extremely expensive. And naturally, not everybody was in a position of hiring a scribe, that the scribe should write for him his own Sefer Torah. Not everybody was able to afford it. But at the same time, everybody did take part in the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah, as we just explained. Then the Rebbe referred, later in the Farbrengen, to a saying of the Rebbe Rashab, which the Rebbe Rashab expressed himself regarding Yutas Kislev. And he used the expression of a medrash. Ma hazayis hazeh kishekoitshinoisoi ata moitzi eshamnoi. Just like an olive, when the olive is crushed, that is when the olive produces the oil. The very same he compared the Alter Rebbe. Once the Alter Rebbe went through a position, so-called using the expression of ketisha, of being crushed spiritually, the fact that he had to go through the idea of prison, that is when afterwards he really began to give oil in a very strong flow. This is what we referred to earlier, that the saying of the Rebbe Rashab, that after Peterburg, after the idea of Yutas Kislev, this is when Hasidus started to spread very strongly. But the Rebbe Rashab explained it with this parable and compared it to the olive, as the olive gives the oil. The Rebbe in today's Farbrengen said it's a saying from the Rebbe Rashab, and naturally everything has to be extremely accurate in it. And really, why is it that the Rebbe Rashab used such type of an expression to compare the Alter Rebbe as to one who's going ahead and crushing an olive? The Rebbe explained we know that on Shabbos it's prohibited to go ahead and crush an olive and derive oil from it. As well as with any type of fruit. We're not allowed to take a fruit on Shabbos and squeeze it out and get the oil from it, and get the juice from it. Rebbe goes on to explain the Alter Rebbe, who was naturally a Talmud Chacham, and the Chazal tell us that a Talmud Chacham is compared to Shabbos. So Memele, it shows us a stronger shayches to the idea, to the Issa of crushing an olive. However, Rebbe explained that there's a maimah of the Tzemach Tzedek in Derech Mitzvah Secha. And the Tzemach Tzedek there explains the mitzvah of Leisavaru Eish B'chol Mosh V'seichem B'yom HaShabbos. This is the mitzvah that tells us that on the Shabbos we are not allowed to go ahead and light any fire. So the Tzemach Tzedek explains, on one hand we see that on Shabbos we are not allowed to go ahead and light any fire. On the other hand we see that Dafke, in the Beis HaMikdash, in the holiest place of the world, Karbanos were brought on Shabbos, and together with every Korban which was brought on Shabbos, a fire was lit. So the Tzemach Tzedek explains it, that there are two inyanim. In the general world, in entire Olam Hazeh, there's take in the Isur of Leisavaru Eish B'chol Mosh V'seichem B'yom HaShabbos. We're prohibited from lighting a fire on Shabbos. However, the Tzemach Tzedek continues, there is a higher madrege, which is the Beis HaMikdash, and the Beis HaMikdash was so powerful to turn around this Issur, that something which on the entire world would be also when it reaches the point of Beis HaMikdash is so powerful that it takes this Issur and is it mahapech leheter and turns it over into heter. That is why in the Beis HaMikdash it would be perfectly okay to go ahead and bring karbanos on Shabbos. Though the bringing of a korban is involved with lighting a fire, which normally is prohibited anywhere else. The very same, the Rebbe continues, is Benegei the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is in the level of Shabbos. However, normally, in Olam Hazeh, there is an Issa of Kedisha on Shabbos. We know that if we crush an olive on Shabbos, first of all, we're not allowed to do it. Second of all, if one does do it, you're not allowed to use this oil on Shabbos. This oil is muktzah on Shabbos. However, the Alter Rebbe was in a higher level. The Alter Rebbe's crushing is compared to the fire, not the fire which is lit anywhere by Olam Hazeh. This is a comparison to the fire which is lit in the Beis HaMikdash. And just like in the Beis HaMikdash, lighting the fire of Shabbos was permissible for the cause of bringing karbanos. The very same the Rebbe compares. The Alter Rebbe also went through the spiritual idea of being crushed. However, the Alter Rebbe's crushing led to the positive results in the sense that this led to a real strong and forceful spreading of Hasidus, which all began after the Alter Rebbe came out of Peterburg. The Rebbe added on, it's symbolic that it's in accordance with the halacha. Halacha is that when oil is crushed, when an olive is crushed on Shabbos, the oil is not allowed to be used on Shabbos, right? The same the Rebbe says. The Alter Rebbe, at the time he went through the crushing period, he wasn't saying Chassidus. Rebbe said it's explained in a Sikh of the Friedeke Rebbe, the difference between the imprisonment of the Alter Rebbe as opposed to the imprisonment of the Mittler Rebbe. And he explains that when the Mittler Rebbe was in prison, they granted him a permission to say Chassidus while he was in prison. It's discussed at length in the Friedeke Rebbe Sichos that while he was in prison, they gave him permission that a minyan or yidden should be able to come in, and he should be able to address them and say Yemaim Chassidus. However, when the Alter Rebbe was in prison, this did not exist. He didn't have this permission. Mamela, so as long as, so to speak, in spiritual sense, so as long as it was like in the level of Shabbos, as long as he went through the Kedisha, as long as he went through the crushing, we didn't benefit from the oil. Once the Alter Rebbe, oil in this sense meaning the Chasidus, which is referred to as Razin, the Razin, Chasidus being compared to oil. However, once the Alter Rebbe was already released from prison, that is when, in other words, after the period of Kedisha, in other words, after he went through the crushing, spiritual crushing, and once he was released from prison, that is when the dissemination of Chasidus really began with a very big force, and this is when Yefutza Meinesecha Chutza really began very strong, all after Yutas Kislev. Today's Farbrengen, the Rebbe learned a Rashi.
What about he discussed how the Yin and Milchama, Nes and Chanukah, it's a Dvar, Hapucho, and how you have to have both of them?
Look at it now. In the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also learned a Zohar in this week's Sedra, as well as a Pirush Rashi in this week's Sedra. And the Zohar, with the commentaries of the Rebbe's father, the Rebbe referred to as Zohar. Zohar raises a question. Yankov knew that his sons, the Shvatim, were not getting along that well with Yosef. As we read right away at the beginning of the Sedra, that Yosef related his dreams, and the pasuk says, "Va'aviv shomer es hadavar." Father knew very well what was going on. However, he noticed what was going on between Yosef and his brothers. So based on that, the Zohar asked, how come that Yankov sent Yosef on a mission to the Shvatim at the time he knew that the relationship between the Shvatim and Yosef wasn't as it should be? So Yankov should have dawned on Yankov's mind, should have dawned on Yankov's mind that something may happen, God forbid, with his son Yosef. So why did he risk Yosef's life and send him in a derech of sakana? At the time, he knew very well that by sending Yosef to his brothers could lead to something which may be very unfavorable. So the Zohar responds, Loi choshed alayu. Yankov did not suspect his children that they should do a thing like that. Why? The Haviyoda, according to Zohar, Yankov knew the kulu have zakoyin, that they're all zakoyim, they're all perfect, all his children. And he did not suspect them in any way that they should do a thing like that to sell Yosef. Ela gorim kuchebrichu kol da. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu lead to all this? So the Zohar responds, begin likayom gzeire de gozar ben absor, so that the Rebbe should be able to fulfill his promise, which he made at the Bris ben Absarim with Avram Avinu. The Rebbe made a promise to Avram Avinu. Ger yizaracha be'eretz lo ilahem, that his children will be in Golus. And later the Rebbe will take him out of exile with a tremendous reward of riches. So Mamela, this is the steps of selling Yosef. All this was done as a preparation to fulfill the arrangement what the Rebbe made with Avram Avinu at the Bris ben Absarim. So this is what's said in the Zohar. The Rebbe's father in his comments makes several comments on this, the way the Zohar uses the expression. First, the Zohar uses the expression alayhu, then he uses an expression loin, two Aramaic expressions. However, the Rebbe got involved a little into the contents of the Indian itself. The Rebbe says we cannot understand what the Zohar responds. What does the Zohar tell us? Zohar tells us that really Yankov's children were perfect. They were zakoyin. However, why did they sell Yosef? Because they were forced into this. Begin lekayama, so that should be able to be fulfilled the gzeire which HaKadosh Baruch Hu had made with Avram Avinu at the Bris ben Absor. So the Rebbe asks, who asked them to get involved in it? I mean, Enochename. The Rebbe made such an arrangement with Avram Avinu. There was a promise made to him that Ger yizaracha be'eretz lo ilahem, and afterwards the Rebbe will take him out. The Rebbe will take him out b'rechush gadol, with a lot of wealth, with a big famegen. However, there were Midyanim, there were the Yishmaelim, as we read in this week's Seder, as we read the details, how Yosef finally got down to Mitzrayim. So Rebbe asked, it could have happened in a much simpler way. Without the brothers getting involved in selling Yosef, it could have happened very simple. That the Midyanim or the Yishmaelim or anyone else, other than the brothers, would have picked up Yosef and sold him to Mitzrayim. Memele Yosef would get down to Mitzrayim. Once Yosef is in Mitzrayim, this already would have led that Yankov should have to come to Mitzrayim, and Memele, this would lead to the arrangement which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has made with Avram Avinu and the Bris ben Absor. But why did the brothers have to have a hand in it that they should get involved in the selling of Yosef? And they were zakoyin, they were perfect. We're talking about the children of Yankov. Yankov Avinu the Rebbe explained, was P'chir Sheba'avis. Amongst the Avis, he was the most outstanding one of them. Now we're talking about Yankiv's children. Yankiv's children, we know the expression which is discussed in Chassidus, it was mitosei shleima. All of Yankiv's children were all perfect, as opposed to Avram, who had Yishmael. Yitzchak had an Esav. By Yankiv, it was a perfect arrangement, mitosei shleima. So by children of Yankiv, children that are being defined as mitosei shleima, why did they have to get involved in it? Why did they have to go ahead and sell Yosef? And from there selling Yosef, Yosef should wind up in Mitzrayim. The fact that the Rebbe promised Avraham Avinu that we would wind up in Mitzrayim, all this could have been fulfilled without the brothers selling Yosef. So the Rebbe explained. The Rebbe says we find in Chazal that Mitzrayim is a land that afilu eved echad in a yochel avoyach misham. Egypt at that time was such a powerful country that even one slave couldn't have had an exodus out of Egypt. Here an entire nation went out biyat skufa with a strong and powerful arm. Rebbe said all this was fulfilled. The Yidden going out of Mitzrayim. The Yidden were able to go out of Mitzrayim only because of the fact that the Shvatim got involved in selling Yosef. Why? The Rebbe explained that when the Shvatim sold Yosef, what's the pshat the Shvatim sold Yosef? This was an arrangement which was made between the Shvatim and Yosef, that Yosef became their slave. Being that Yosef became their slave, they had ownership on Yosef, so Memela in turn they were able to sell him and do whatever they wanted with him, as we read all the details in this week's Chazarah. And Memela, so they sold Yosef to the Midyanim, and they sold Yosef, and in turn this is how Yosef wound up to Mitzrayim, and this led that Yankiv and everybody should come to Mitzrayim, and Memela it led to the Gzeir of Ben Absarim to be fulfilled, to the arrangement that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu made with Avraham Avinu, that it should be finalized. However, all this, the Rebbe is learning, was able to come true only because of the fact that Yosef became first a slave to his brothers. And Memela, this remained. So Yosef was an Eved to the Yada Shvatim, and based on that is how Yosef was sold and got down into Mitzrayim.
Where do we learn about that? That he was.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have had any authority to sell him. That's what the Rebbe is learning pshat. They wouldn't have been able to sell him. How could they go ahead and sell a person? Pshat is this person became their slave, became their Eved. Memela, once he became their Eved, this gave him an authority to go ahead and sell him.
Well, first they wanted to kill him. If they could kill him, Kolshkin, they could sell him.
All because he became their Eved. Because it's their ownership, it's Kinyan Kaspai. I mean, let's not get involved if the dinim of Matan Torah are going on here or are not going on here. But Yosef became their ownership. So the Rebbe is learning pshat that if not for Yosef being first a slave to his brothers, but Yosef if Yosef would not have been a slave to his brothers, but Yosef would have came down to Mitzrayim as a free person that the Midyanim picked up, then the Yidden would have never been able to leave Mitzrayim. Why? Because Mitzrayim is a mokim shafilu eved echad eini yochel levrayach misham. Mitzrayim is a place that has never let out any slave out of there. Mitzrayim is extremely powerful. And Mitzrayim would not have let the Yidden out had Yosef come down, not previously becoming a slave to his brothers. However, the Rebbe is learning, being that Yosef became an eved to his brothers first, so Yosef had a shibud to his brothers. Memela, as a result of his shibud to his brothers, they in turn were able to sell him to Mitzrayim, to sell him to the Midyanim, and that's how he wound up in Mitzrayim. So this is Pshat in the Zohar. Gorim Kutchebrichu called the Rebishter caused all this. Begin l'kayama, so that the Gzeir of the Gaza ben Absarim that the Rebishter made up with Avraham Avinu should be able to be fulfilled. This had to be done only through Yosef, through the Shvatim and Yosef. Had it been through any other channels, then Chas v'Chalila, the Yidden would have never been able to leave Mitzrayim. What? You mean halachically?
No, not halachically. What act made him a slave to his brothers?
It seems like the way the Rebbe would explain it this afternoon, it seems like when Yosef realized that he was lost and they had complete control over him, it was like an arrangement that Yosef agreed to become their slave. This is how the Rebbe explained it to him. Also with Mechiras Yosef. And it deals, Kapitel Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Chav Gimel. Pasuk says, Vahi kasher bo Yosef elechav, Yosef came to his brothers, Vayafshitu es Yosef es kutontei, es ksoines hapasim asher olav. So the brothers took off Yosef's shirt. Then the pasuk goes ahead, es ksoines hapasim asher olav. Rashi, es kutontei ze chaluk, means a robe, shirt. Ksoines hapasim, Rashi learns pshat, hu shahoisif loy aviv yoser alecha. What does the ksoines pasim mean? This is what his brother, his father, has given him, this beautiful, outstanding shirt, more than what his brothers had. What do we see from Rashi? That Rashi is learning pshat in the pasuk that Yosef wore two garments. There was the ksoines, which Rashi interprets means a chaluk, and this ksoines, obviously, every one of the brothers had this type of a shirt. Together with it, he also had a ksoines hapasim, the beautiful shirt, which Yankov has given to Yosef, something which his brothers did not have. So the Rebbe questioned, why is Rashi forced to learn that the pasuk here is talking about two garments? Why can't Rashi learn glatik that it's one garment? Why is there a second expression of es in the pasuk? First the pasuk says es kutontoi. Then the pasuk uses again an expression es kesoines hapasim asher olav. So the Rebbe says we find many times in the pasuk that first the pasuk uses one general word, then comes in following words that describe the previous expression. So Mamela, first the pasuk says that Yosef wore a shirt. Vayeshev es Yosef, they took off his shirt. They took him off his shirt. What type of shirt was Yosef wearing? So the pasuk goes ahead weiter and tells us what was the shirt he was wearing. Ksoines hapasim. He was wearing the beautiful shirt which his father presented him. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, if we look weiter in the pasuk Lamed Aleph, pasuk says, Vayikchu es ksoines Yosef. The brothers took the shirt of Yosef, Vayishchetu sirizim, they shechted a goat, Vayitpelu es hakotenes badam. And they took the ksoines, the shirt, and they dipped it into blood. Vayishlechu es ksoines hapasim, and they took this ksoines hapasim, Vayaviu al avim, and they brought it to their father. Vayomru, and they said, Zeis matzanu, this is what we found. Hakirno, please recognize haksoines bin chohim lo. Is this the shirt of your child or isn't it? As the pasuk goes on, Vayakira Yankov did recognize it and so forth. Here already, there's no, if the way Rashi is learning pshat, it's not in accordance with the psukim here. Because from the psukim here it seems that there is only one shirt that Yosef had, and this is the shirt that they took and dipped into the blood of the goat, and this is the shirt that they brought back to Yankov. From pasuk Chav Gimel, it seems that Yosef wore two shirts. From pasuk Lamed Aleph, we see that was only one shirt that they dipped in the blood of the goat. If it is the way Rashi is learning pshat and pasuk Chav Gimel that Yosef really wore two shirts, why didn't they take both shirts and dip it in the blood of the goat and bring both shirts back to Yankov? So this strengthens the Rebbe's kasha that really, obviously, the pasuk should only be talking about one type of a shirt. And this shirt, which Yosef wore, was a real special shirt. It was a shirt which can be defined as a ksoines pasuk. So the Rebbe is learning pshat. What's forcing Rashi in Pshutei Shel Mikra to lead us to say that when they undressed Yosef, they undressed him two shirts? Psukim go on, Vayikachu, they took Yosef, Vayeshlichu Yosef habayra, they threw him into a pit. Vahabayreik, it was an empty pit, ein b'mayim, there was no water. However, Rashi comments, there was no water, mayim ein b'y, aval nachoshem v'akrabim yesh b'y. There were snakes which were extremely harmful to Yosef, and the brothers overlooked all that, and this is where they threw Yosef into. If we look weiter on Pasuk Chavav, we see, Vayomer Yehuda alechav, Yehuda exclaimed to his brothers, Ma betza kinare gesachinu. So Rashi comments, what means Ma betza? Ma betza means Ma momoin. What financially will we gain from killing our brother? What do we see from all this? That when the Shvatim were involved here in the idea of Mechiras Yosef, they were looking for money. They were looking for Betza. Memela, that is why Yehuda exclaimed, Ma Betza, what will we gain? Ma Momin, what kind of financial satisfaction can we have if we will kill our brother? What do we see from this, from the Hemshech HaPsukim? That what they were looking for was for money. Memela, if Yosef came to them, and the Pasuk uses the expression, Vayavshitu es Yosef es kutontoi, and as Ksainas HaPasim. Pasuk uses both expressions. They took off Yosef his shirt, and then the Pasuk goes ahead and says, es Ksainas HaPasim, the very beautiful shirt, they took off Yosef as well. Being that Rashi sees, the child sees here, how Rashi is going in a trend, that what the brothers are trying to do from Yosef is they're trying to rip off, they're trying to gain money. Memela, Rashi is learning pshat that Yosef wore 2 shirts. Memela, if they had 2 shirts, their cheshm was they will take away both shirts from Yosef. First, Yosef had a very expensive shirt, a very nice shirt. And this was the Ksainas HaPasim. However, together with it, Yosef wore a plain shirt as well. And the brothers were in such a mood at the time that they were looking for ma betza, ma momoin. They were looking for a result of money. They were looking for a financial satisfaction. Memela, everything meant something to them. So on one hand, they wanted to take away his Ksainas HaPasim, but nonetheless, Yosef was wearing a plain shirt. They wanted to take away his plain shirt from him as well. That's one way the Rebbe is learning. Another way the Rebbe is learning, being that we see how the brothers wanted to harm Yosef, and they threw him into a boil, which was reik, which was empty of water. However, as Chazal tell us, and Rashi quotes it here, not only was it empty of water, but it was harmful. It was a boil which contained nechoshem and akrabim. So Memela, the brothers wanted to harm Yosef. So Memela vayafshitu, they were undressing Yosef. Vahikan sheba Yosef alechav, vayafshitu, they undressed him. So Memela, they wanted Yosef to be hurt. They wanted Yosef to be harmed. Memela, what did they undress him? They undressed him, sai his regular shirt, or sai his Ksainas HaPasim, in order that Yosef should be harmed stronger. It should be more sakana for Yosef. So not only did they take away his Ksainas HaPasim, the beautiful shirt, which made him an exception from amongst his brothers, which was the shirt which Yankov presented him with, but they also took off his regular shirt, his kutantai, which Rashi comments what means kutantai chaluk. In other words, this is something which not only Yosef had, all the other Shvatim also had a chaluk. They also had an average shirt, a plain shirt. However, being that they were eager to harm Yosef, Mamela, this leads Rashi to learn pshat, because Rashi is looking on the Hemshech HaPsukim in Pshuta Shel Mikra. And in Pshuta Shel Mikra we see how the brothers wanted to harm Yosef. So Mamela, if they wanted to harm him, it is naturally, this leads Rashi to learn that they were looking for a stronger way to harm him. Stronger way is to learn pshat that Ksainas HaPasim is one type of a shirt, and Kutanta is a second type of a shirt. Rebbe also went.
Also that the choluk they sold it also to get more money.
Right.
That they only sent it.
And that is why when it came to send, later they realized that they're in a dilemma with Yankov, so they had to take the Ksainas HaPasim, though it was something expensive, and send it back to Yankov. Why? Because otherwise Yankov would be looking for Yosef, would be searching for Yosef, and they thought they'd be able to tell him, Torah Yosef. This is the assumption that Yankov was under. However, why Taka didn't they send him the regular chaluk? Because this Taka they sold. The Ksainas HaPasim, this was something which would define Yosef, which was something which was a means of an identification for Yosef. This they used to send back to Yankov. And the regular shirt, the chaluk which he took away from him, they were Taka in a pchina of ma betza, ma momain. The mele this they sold for momain. Later the Rebbe went on explaining how bemis every Yid possesses a chaluk, and every Yid possesses a Ksainas HaPasim. In other words, we're talking about levushim. Says the Yid has his neshama, then on top of the neshama, Yid has levushim, has clothing. And here in this sense, we're talking about spiritual clothing. What's the pshat of spiritual clothing? There's a chaluk, meaning something which this does not define Yosef from his brothers. It means this is something which every Yid has. In other words, an average amount of Torah mitzvahs and an average amount of qualifications which every Yid possesses. This falls into the category of chaluk. Then there is another madrege. there's a madrega of Kseines HaPasim. What's the pshat of Kseines HaPasim? Here the Rebbe explained that at many times, Kseines HaPasim by Yosef was not something which Yosef put effort into. This was something which his father gave him as a present. As Rashi tells us here, this is something which his father added on to him on top of what the brothers had. Rebbe said, amongst Yidden we also find the same type of a situation. Many times we find many people that they're fortunate enough that they have Kseines Pasim on them. What's the pshat to have Kseines Pasim? It says at times, many were zeicha to learn in a Chassidish yeshiva. This is something which we ourselves don't even know why we have this chus. And this is something additional which we have a schus of learning a Tamchet Mimim. We have a schus of having a shaychus to Chasidus. And Chasidus is something which is, not every Yid has a shaychus to. And we were fortunate to have this inyan of the Kseines Pasim, of having a shaychus to Chasidus. At times the Rebbe says, different situations. Many times there are children that are born into Hasidic families and get a Hasidic upbringing. And this is something which is totally not dependent on themselves. This is, the luck was, min hashamayim, that they were born into this family. Memela, they're getting this type of an upbringing and they're sent to such type of an education. And this is a spiritual Kseines Pasim which we find by Yidden. The idea of having a shaychus to Chassidus. We ourselves don't even know for what reason did we merit this Kseines Pasim. The Rebbe concluded that we really have to treasure and appreciate the situation that we are brought into. Whatever level it may be talking about, where a Yid gets this type of a Kseines Pasim, this is something additional, this is a type of a lavush, which not everyone has, and this is something which Avinu Shebeshamayim has given us something additional which we are to utilize, and it should be utilized properly. Again, many times we are in such type of a situation, we have a shaychus to Chassidus, and we have a shaychus to all these inyanim, and we don't utilize this Kseines Pasim properly. And here the Rebbe demanded that when we do get this gift from Avinu, from our father, something which is more than our brother, something which not every Yid has, it is our obligation to see to it and utilize this properly. Ram reminded me at the beginning of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also discussed how we find by Chanukah, and we recited in the Vala Nisim, that it was a Mulchama. It was a Mulchama, the Yevonim, and the Yidden. So we use the expression, we praise the Rebishter, Masarta Giboyrim Biyad Chaloshim. That the Rebishter has given over strong people in the hand of weak. The Rebbe explained, what's the pshat? Giboyrim Biyad Chaloshim. That a person should never sit back and say that he's not going to have part in the spiritual Mulchama. There's a Mulchama going on. There's a spiritual war going on. Not always it's a physical war. So a person will say he's weak. He doesn't want to have any shaychus to it. He's not powerful. He's not powerful enough. Mameli doesn't want to have a shaychus to the Mulchama. We find by Chizkiyahu HaMelech, we find that Chizkiyahu was a Sheichev al Mitasei. We read in Tanakh that he was laying in bed and he prayed to the Rebishter that the Rebishter should go ahead and run the battle for him. Rebbe says we cannot follow and take a lesson from Chizkiyahu. This was something which was an extraordinary situation. The Rebishter at that time gave Chizkiyahu something real special. Chizkiyahu HaMelech was able to lay in bed, Shachve al Mitasei, and the Rebishter ran a battle for him. However, by Chanukah we find Masarta Giboyrim Biyad Chaloshim. Whoever set up the Tefillah of Vala Nisim defines as the Yevonim as Giboyrim, and defines the Yidden as Chaloshim. That it was not the pshat we were strong. We are mamish chaloshim. We are weak people. So Mamela, one can sit back and say if he's not strong enough, he's not powerful enough, why should he go ahead and take part in the spiritual Mulchama? He will sit back and whatever will happen, will happen. He will act like Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Chizkiyahu was able to accomplish this, that he was laying in bed and the Rebishter ran the battle for him. Why should we get involved in running spiritual battles and getting involved and convincing other Yidden and going out into the spiritual battlefield and reaching out to other Yidden for Afatzas HaYadus and Afatzas HaMayones? We will take a lesson from Chizkiyahu. So the Rebbe says no. We have to take the lesson from Chanukah. And by Chanukah we find Masarta Giboyrim Biyad Chaloshim. The Rebishter made a nest and the Rebishter turned over the Giboyrim in the hands of the weak ones. However, we don't see that the weak people should have said to themselves, well, we're weak, we have no koyches to go into the battle, we will stay home. How can we go ahead and get involved against such strong and powerful koyches? They didn't say that. Though they themselves knew that they are chaloshim, still they went out involved in Mulchemes Mitzvah involved in Milchama, what they had to do in Yonah for the Rebbeishter, they had to do in Yonah for Kedusha, they didn't take any cheshbonus into consideration, though they knew themselves, by themselves, that they can be classified only as Chalashim. Still they went out, and they went out into battle against the Gebayrim. And we see that the Rebbeishter takes these things into consideration, and when Chalashim go out against Gebayrim, the Rebbeishter Sof from his end also performs a nes, and he fulfills Masar to Gebayrim biyad Chalashim, that the Gebayrim come into the hands of the Chalashim, and the Chalashim are the ones that succeed. Okay,